It was like nobody could hear me, one survivor later said. Why didn't they run? Why didn't they scream? Why didn't someone help? These haunting questions still echoed decades after Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes were exposed. As chilling as the acts themselves was the silence that surrounded them, silence that cost lives. In this video, we're diving into the psychological manipulation, social biases, and systemic failures that made it nearly impossible for Dahmer's victims to escape or be believed. This isn't just a story about a killer, it's about the silenced, the ignored, and the overlooked. Let's break it down. The first time I really sat with the list of Dahmer's victims, I felt this pit in my stomach. Not because of what he did, although that's obviously horrific, but because of how eerily invisible most of these young men had been. You start to notice a pattern real fast, and not just in the crimes, but in the kinds of lives these people lived before they ever crossed paths with him. Most of Dahmer's victims were young. We're talking late teens to mid-20s. Some were still figuring themselves out, navigating tough environments, sometimes even homelessness. Many of them were black, Latino, or Southeast Asian. Most were also part of the LGBTQ plus community. That combo, being a person of color and gay in the late 80s and early 90s Midwest, it made them way too easy to overlook, especially by a system that, let's be real, wasn't built to protect them in the first place. I remember reading about Konerak Sinthasomphone, a 14-year-old Laotian boy who literally escaped Dahmer's apartment. Neighbors called the police and get this, they actually returned him to Dahmer. Dahmer told them they were in a lover's quarrel and the cops just left him there. That moment sticks with me because it's like, wow, how many times did society get a chance to listen and just didn't? When you look at how Dahmer chose his victims, it wasn't random, it was calculated. He sought out places like gay bars and bus stops, spaces where marginalized people often gathered, but where few outside those communities were paying attention. He knew how to charm, he offered money, drinks, or just friendly conversation, but more than anything, he preyed on people he knew wouldn't be missed right away. Now, I'm not saying these men didn't have people who loved them, many of them did, but being poor, non-white, or queer meant their disappearances weren't treated with urgency. Some families begged the police for help and got brushed off. It's heartbreaking, and yeah, it makes you angry too. I guess what haunts me the most is that we still see this today, right? Victims who don't fit the mold of innocence or relatability just don't get them the same airtime. It's something we have to keep talking about, even if it's uncomfortable. If there's one lesson from all this, it's that who society listens to matters, and who it ignores, that says even more. This is one of those topics that hits different once you stop asking why didn't they run and start asking what made them freeze. I used to think fight or flight were the only two options when someone was in danger. But when I started learning about trauma responses like freezing, fawning, or even dissociating, it changed the whole picture for me. And it made what happened with Dahmer's victims make a heartbreaking kind of sense. Let's start with what he did. Dahmer wasn't some growling monster bursting into people's homes. He came off as soft-spoken, polite, even lonely. He'd offer a drink, a place to hang out, maybe a few dollars for a modeling gig. Sometimes there were drugs involved, often slipped in without the victim's knowledge. It wasn't a snatch and grab situation. It was calculated. He built false trust and used just enough normal to lower their guard. Once they were in his space, his apartment, it was like a trap shutting. Some victims were drugged before they even knew what hit them. Others were conscious, terrified, but completely disoriented. And here's the thing, when you're in that kind of environment, fear doesn't always push you to act. It can paralyze you. The brain literally shuts down the parts that make quick decisions. That freeze response, it's real, and it's so misunderstood. I once sat through a trauma workshop where they talked about how the brain prioritizes survival over action. Sometimes that means staying still and trying not to upset your captor, complying, smiling, pretending everything's okay. It sounds counterintuitive until you've been in a situation where saying no feels like a death sentence. sentence. And Dahmer, he knew that. He used it. He thrived off the silence his manipulation created. The fear, the shame, the drugs, even the confusion around his sexual orientation, the cultural stigma at the time, it all worked in his favor. He built a space where victims didn't know what was real. And even if they did, they often believed no one would believe them. I've never been in a situation like that, but I've talked to people who said they didn't scream or run because they were trying to survive in the only way they knew how. And man, that stuck with me. So no, it's not as simple as why didn't they leave? The better question is, what made them feel like they couldn't? This one's tough because it's not just about Dahmer anymore. It's about the system that basically held the door open for him. I remember the first time I read about Konerak Sinthasomphone, the 14-year-old boy who escaped Dahmer's apartment and ran out into the street, naked, bleeding, drugged, and clearly terrified. Two women called 911. They stayed with him. They did everything right, but when the police showed up and Dahmer calmly told them this was just a lover's path, they handed the boy back over. That moment still haunts me. The thing is, that wasn't some one-off mistake. That was 1991 Milwaukee, where the racial bias, homophobia, and a deep mistrust between communities and police were baked into the system. Most of Dahmer's victims were black, Latino, or Southeast Asian, and many were gay in that era. And honestly, still too often now, those identities meant you weren't taken seriously. You were seen as other, or worse, disposable. I don't say that lightly. There were parents who begged police to look for their sons and got brushed off. People who smelled something foul coming from Dahmer's apartment but weren't listened to. And every time the authorities chose to believe the calm white man over the scared young black or Asian victim, or the neighbor who knew something was off. I think what really breaks me is how obvious the red flags were. If someone like Glenda Cleveland, Dahmer's neighbor, had been taken seriously from the beginning, maybe half those boys would still be alive. But again, she was a black woman calling about a gay Southeast Asian boy. Not exactly a combo the police in that time and place were eager to act on. It's frustrating and heartbreaking, but it's also a huge lesson in how systems fail people before predators ever get the chance to. Dahmer knew he could get away with it. He banked on the silence that came from mistrust and societal bias, and over again, the system proved him right. I'm not saying every cop back then was evil, but the culture, the policies, the apathy, that stuff is dangerous because it creates the perfect cover for monsters who know nobody's watching the right people. If you really want to understand how Jeffrey Dahmer got away with it for so long, you have to look beyond just him. You've got to look at the culture, the time, the unspoken rules, because the silence around his crimes didn't just come from fear. It came from decades of people being told in so many ways your pain doesn't matter. Let's start with the obvious. Being gay in the late 80s and early 90s was not easy. The LGBTQ plus community was still reeling from the AIDS crisis, constantly demonized in the media and pushed into the shadows. A lot of Dahmer's victims were young gay men of color who were either closeted or living in communities where coming out could literally get you disowned, or worse. So when these guys went missing, it wasn't like the world stopped spinning. In many cases, it barely noticed. I once spoke to someone who came out during that time, and he said calling the police never felt safe. There was always this sense that they'd either ignore you or treat you like the problem. And that wasn't just paranoia, it was real. There were stories all over the country of cops laughing off complaints from gay men, or worse, using them as targets. Add racism on top of that, now you're talking about double the invisibility. It's not surprising that communities of color didn't trust the police. They had every reason not to. From wrongful arrests, ignored pleas for help. The justice system didn't exactly earn anyone's fate. So even when something felt off, like strange behavior in the neighborhood, missing people, or that awful smell, people hesitated to speak up, and when they did, they were brushed off, dismissed, told they were imagining things. But here's the heartbreaking part. Some victims did try to get help, some even escaped, like we talked about earlier. But the stigma, the fear of not being believed, of being judged, of being outed, it kept them silent. Imagine being a young man, drugged, confused, and terrified, trying to tell someone what happened, and realizing they're just just not going to listen, or worse, they're going to blame you. That silence didn't come from weakness, it came from centuries of being ignored. Honestly, this part of the story always gives me chills because it's one thing to read about what happened, it's another to hear it from the people who lived through it and were ignored. Let's start with Tracy Edwards, the man who finally escaped and led the police to Dahmer's apartment in 1991. Without him, who knows how much longer it would have gone on. His story is terrifying. Dahmer lured him in with a promise of cash for photos. Pretty common move for Dahmer, but when Edwards got there, he knew something was off quick. The handcuffs, the knife, the vibe. Edwards stayed calm, talked his way out, and ran the second he saw an opening. Can you imagine the strength it takes to stay calm in that moment? He later said he was trying to keep Dahmer calm to stay alive. That's trauma logic right there. Survival instinct over everything. But here's the wild part. When Edwards ran for help, he still wasn't immediately believed. Even after escaping with a cuff on his wrist, some people thought he was hired or just another guy causing trouble. Luckily, the police followed him back to the apartment, and that's when everything finally unraveled. Then there's Glinda Cleveland, Dahmer's neighbor. She's one of the people I think about the most. She saw things, heard things, smelled things, and she called the police more than once. She even called after seeing a dazed and bleeding boy, Konerak, trying to escape. She begged them to take a second look, told them something wasn't right, but they didn't listen. They believed Dahmer over her, maybe because she was a black woman, maybe because he was a calm, white man in glasses, probably both. And you know what's even sadder? She blamed herself afterward, like she hadn't done enough, like she'd failed them, but she didn't. The system did. Some of the people who got away or lived near Dahmer struggled with years of guilt. Survivors talked about being haunted by what ifs. What if they'd spoken up louder? What if they'd pushed harder? That kind of internal conflict is so unfair. They did speak, they tried, but no one listened. No one accounted. The truth is, these people were brave. Their stories are what finally brought the truth to light. They shouldn't be remembered just as side characters. They're the reason it all stopped. I'll be honest, talking about this stuff gets heavy, but what hits the hardest isn't just the horror of what Jeffrey Dahmer did, it's how avoidable so much of it was. If people had listened, if systems had worked, if victims had been seen as worth protecting, their silence wasn't a failure on their part, it was a failure of society. So what can we actually do with that? For one, we've got to stop brushing off the voices of people we don't understand. That means really listening, especially when it comes from folks who've been marginalized. If someone says something feels wrong, even if they don't have all the evidence, or they seem afraid or unsure, we still need to hear them. Dismissing someone because they're young, poor, gay, non-white, or struggling with addiction, that's how we end up there again. I used to think red flags were always obvious. Screaming, chaos, broken windows, but honestly, the biggest red flags are subtle. Isolation, controlling behavior, someone not letting their partner speak for themselves, a person being too quiet or too obedient. That kind of power imbalance often looks like nothing on the outside, but once you know what to look for, it's glaring. You also need to have way more open conversations about coercion and control. Not every dangerous person looks scary. Dahmer didn't. He used calmness like a weapon, and that's something predators rely on, being the last person you'd suspect. So teaching people, especially kids and teens, how to recognize manipulation tactics, that's not paranoia, that's survival. One thing I try to do now, and I hope more of us start doing, is just believing people the first time, not waiting for it to get serious enough, not needing 100 red flags to validate their fear. That culture of doubt we have, it's deadly. And hey, even if you're not in law enforcement or a social worker or anything official, just being someone who sees people can save lives. The neighbor who checks in, the teacher who doesn't ignore weird behavior, the friend who listens even when it's uncomfortable. Because silence isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's a survival tactic. So it's honest to create a world where people don't have to whisper their pain, or worse, keep it to themselves, because they know no one's listening. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't act in a vacuum. He thrived in one. The silence of his victims wasn't weakness. It was a symptom of deep societal failure. They were not just murdered, they were ignored, dismissed, and forgotten until it was far too late. If we don't learn from that silence, we risk repeating appreciating it. Let's do better. Let's listen. Let's amplify voices before they become eulogies.